today I want to talk about something that I think all of us at some point in time we can relate to. For some of you, you're going to relate to this because you're going to be in the space I'm talking about today. For others of you, maybe you're not experiencing this, but one day you will experience it. Today, I want to talk about how God meets us in our pain, how to navigate through our pain and suffering and struggle to the other side. And I want to do this by looking at what I think is arguably one of the most important and powerful stories of Jesus in the Gospels. I want to look at the story of Jesus as he's face down in the middle of the night, sweating blood in a garden called Gethsemane. Because it turns out this garden called Gethsemane, it has a lot to say about God, and it has a lot to say to each and every one of us when it comes to navigating the difficulties, the trials, the struggles, and the sufferings that we may experience in this life. And so it's with that in mind, let's go to Matthew chapter 26. Each gospel author, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and when I say gospel, those 4 books are biographies about the life of Jesus. And each author included the story that we're about to read. They all seem to believe this moment was too important, that we cannot miss what happens here because we needed to see Jesus in Gethsemane. In verse 36, it says this: Then Jesus went with them to the olive grove called Gethsemane, and he said, "Sit here while I go over there to pray." He took Peter and Zebedee's 2 sons, James and John, and he became anguished and distressed. He told them, "My soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." He went on a little farther and bowed with his face to the ground, praying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me. Yet I want your will to be done, not mine." And then he returned to the disciples, and he found them asleep. He said to Peter, "Couldn't you watch with me even 1 hour? Keep watch and pray so that you will not give in to temptation. For the spirit is willing, but the body is weak." Then Jesus left them a second time and prayed, "My Father, if this cup cannot be taken away unless I drink it, your will be done." When he returned to them again, he found them sleeping again, for they couldn't keep their eyes open. So he went and prayed a third time, saying the same things again. Then he came to the disciples and said, "Go ahead and sleep, have your rest. But look, the time has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Up, let's be going. Look, my betrayer is here." Let's pause and pray. Father, right now, God, I don't know where every person is in this room, but you do. And all of us at some point in time will find ourselves in Gethsemane. Maybe we're there now. Maybe we're going to be there next week or next year. But Gethsemane is a reality not only for you, but for us. Those moments where we feel deep distress, anguish, and a weight on our heart that's hard, if not impossible, to carry on our own. So this morning, God, I pray that you would meet us all in Gethsemane, that you would meet us and reveal to us a depth of your character maybe we've never known, but also help us to experience a depth of trust that we've maybe never given to you. Let today be a day of surrender, God. Speak to us, each and every one of us. We love you, and we ask this in Jesus' name, and everybody said, amen. Amen. So for all my note takers in the room, today the title of the talk is Don't Skip Gethsemane. Don't skip Gethsemane. In fact, I would argue, even if you tried to skip Gethsemane, you would never be able to. Gethsemane is a reality that all of us at some point in time will have to face. That pain and life seem to go hand in hand. Is anyone here a big fan of the show Severance? Yeah. Okay, so I won't spoil the finale that happened this past week, but Severance, largely, there's many things, and I think I understand some of it. The one part I do understand about Severance is it's a story about people trying to manufacture a life without pain. And the spoiler alert, you already know, there is no life without pain. That pain and life go hand in hand. You may experience it now, you may experience it later, but the truth of the matter is all of us will experience pain on some level in this life. And it's in those moments where we find ourselves deep in pain and suffering and distress that I believe we have this story of Gethsemane, Jesus praying in distress and anguish given to each and every one of us to help us navigate our pain, but also to understand God in the midst of our pain. Now, there's three types of pain that all of us in different ways at different times have experienced, right? The first is chosen pain, right? Chosen pain. Some of you don't know this because I'm wearing a jacket right now, but like I have a full sleeve of tattoos on my left arm. And if that offends you that a pastor has tattoos, you can email me at ericvelez@gmail.org. I would love to not read it. So anyways, I have a full tattoo, and now some people are like, does it hurt? Which is kind of a funny question to ask about tattoos. And the short answer is, yes, it does. It does not feel good. It doesn't feel like baby angels are massaging your arm for a couple hours. It feels like a cat is like clawing your arm for like 2 hours straight. And some of you are like, that sounds awful. I know, right? And what's even crazier is I chose to do it, and I paid someone to do it. Like we all experience chosen pain, where you experience struggle and pain as a result of something that you chose to do. But then there's also deserved pain, right? Where you experience the ramifications of a decision that you made. And all of us, none of us in this room are perfect. This is a church of imperfect people who are in progress. And so if you're imperfect, join the party. That's all of us. All of us have made decisions that are bad decisions. All of us have made decisions that we look back on, and in hindsight, we go, that was maybe not my best moment. And for some of you, if not all of us, we've made decisions that we've actually had to pay the price for, right? It's deserved pain. Like you bought that thing, even though you know you didn't have the money for it, so you went into debt, and now you're paying off that debt. Or maybe you had friends around you that told you not to date that person. They're like, that person's crazy. You don't want to date them. You're like, no, you don't know him like I know him. And so you proceeded to date him and found out your friends were right. And then you pay the price of a maybe unhealthy relationship. Like all of us have experienced deserved pain, right? We have chosen pain and we have deserved pain, but then there's the third pain, and this is the worst of them all. It's unjust pain, right? Isn't that the worst? Like chosen pain you can deal with because you're like, I signed up for this, right? I chose this. And even deserved pain, you can at least understand it on some level because you realize that you're experiencing what you're experiencing because of the decisions that you made. You're like, so I'm kind of getting what I deserve here, but it's unjust pain. That's hard, isn't it? You didn't choose it. You didn't deserve it. But you find yourself experiencing it. Pain like abuse, pain like a miscarriage, getting laid off, the death of a loved one, depression or anxiety. None of these pains are pains that you either choose or deserve. They're unjust pain. And I've seen more people walk away from Jesus because of unjust pain than any other reason. Trying to make sense of pain in this life. If God is so good, then why am I experiencing this unjust pain? And I want to look at the Garden of Gethsemane because the Garden of Gethsemane is this beautiful moment where we see that God meets us in our pain. Like, I don't know about you, I'm glad that God didn't enter into the human story as Jesus and just sort of float through life and never experience struggle or abandonment or pain or suffering, because I feel like it would make Jesus lose a lot of credibility. Instead, what we see is a God who not only entered into the human story, but he entered into all of the human story, including the pain and suffering that we experience. And there is no greater picture of this than in Matthew 26 in the Garden of Gethsemane. What I want to teach today is that there's a garden that you cannot skip, and that's Gethsemane. There's a garden that all of us will find ourselves face down, begging God to get us out of. And that garden is called Gethsemane. And if you're not there now, you will be there at some point in time, wondering, where is God in it? And how do I get through it? And the good news is that through the example of Jesus, we learn 4 things about God, and we learn a few things about ourselves as well. And I want to spend the rest of our time talking about those 4 things that we can learn from Gethsemane to help you when you find yourself in Gethsemane yourself. The first thing is this, that Gethsemane shows us that we serve a God who bleeds. Gethsemane shows us we serve a God who bleeds. Jesus is evidence that in our darkest hours, God didn't send humanity thoughts and prayers. In our darkest moment, God didn't send good vibes to humanity. In our darkest hour, God didn't post on Instagram, #PrayForHumanity. What did God do? God entered into our space and time. He put on flesh. And not only did he put on flesh, he bled with us and he bled for us. Have you ever heard someone talk about something and it was painfully obvious they had no idea what they were talking about? Or you had heard somebody giving advice about something that they had never actually experienced before? I mean, you can tell when someone has skipped the garden, right? You can tell when someone hasn't gone through the garden themselves. You can tell it in their language. You can tell it in their perspective. You can tell it in their judgments that a person has skipped the garden. It's hard, if not impossible, to trust someone who hasn't experienced the garden themselves. And this is one reason I think that we can actually trust Jesus. Because when Jesus entered into the human story, Jesus did not skip the garden. He walked through this earth. He experienced this life. He experienced pain and suffering. He had friends abandon him. There were moments where he asked God, let this cup of suffering pass from me. But he was crucified anyways. Have you ever had a moment where you asked God to do one thing and the very thing you didn't want God to do took place? Where it felt like God did the exact opposite of what you wanted him to do? Jesus experienced that himself. It reminds me of what St. Augustine once said. He said, God has one son on earth without sin, but not one without suffering. He has one son on earth without sin, but not one without suffering, meaning this: Jesus endured the pain and suffering that we experience in our lives. And I don't know about you, I'm grateful for that. Because wouldn't it render your prayers useless if you brought your pain and suffering to God and you're like, God, here's my pain, here's my anguish, here's my distress, here's my suffering. And God's like, oh, that must be a bummer. I can't relate at all, though. Like, it would almost render your prayers useless. But we don't have a God who doesn't understand our pain. We have a God who experienced it and walked through it all with us. I mean, it's like one thing to talk to a person who read a really good book about depression. It's a whole nother thing to talk to someone who has actually experienced the dark night of the soul, which is depression, isn't it? It's one thing to talk to a person who knows somebody else who lost a loved one, but it's a whole nother thing to talk to someone who has a firsthand experience of losing a loved one. Jesus went through Gethsemane so that we can know that we're not alone, so that Jesus could have the firsthand experience of the suffering and pain that we will experience in this life. Jesus didn't skip the garden because we don't get to either. See, this is exactly what fueled the faith of the author in Hebrews. In Hebrews chapter 4, he writes this. He says, this high priest, he's talking about Jesus. He says, this high priest of ours understands our weaknesses, for he faced all the same testings we do, yet he did not sin. So let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. There we will receive his mercy, and we will find grace to help us when we need it most. The author is like, what fuels my faith? What fuels my faith is knowing that God went through Gethsemane and he didn't die in the garden, so neither will I. Neither will I. You see, Gethsemane teaches us that God bleeds. But the second thing that Gethsemane teaches us that we need to see is that Jesus in Gethsemane is showing us how to be human. He's actually liberating us to be human. What do I mean by that? He's in a garden, and you saw this, and 3 times we're told, Jesus says, my soul is being crushed. I am in distress. I am in anguish. Jesus isn't just having like a bad morning. He's not just like a little upset. It's not like he just missed the Muni, right? It's not like the DoorDasher forgot his drink with his order. Jesus is at his most vulnerable, pain-filled moment, so much so that Luke actually says that he sweat blood. Now, I've never been that stressed. I've never been that distressed. I've never experienced that much anguish. When the Warriors blew a 3-1 lead in 2016, that's the closest I think I ever got to sweating blood. But even then, I can't even relate to the depth of anguish that Jesus was experiencing. But Jesus is here showing us something that's huge. And he's showing us that to admit your humanity is not a lack of faith. To admit that you're struggling, to admit that you're in distress, to admit that your heart is being crushed, Jesus is showing us that it doesn't mean a lack of faith. It's interesting, right? Because sometimes church people, they're funny, right? I wasn't raised in the church. So I remember coming into this thing, not knowing anything, and it all being very new. And it was always interesting to me how many times somebody would come in with their pain and their suffering and their anguish, and they would be met with this like, well, just, you need to have more faith. If you just believed a little bit more, prayed a little bit longer, went to church more, then you wouldn't suffer the way that you're suffering. What's interesting though is no one has ever said that about Jesus in this moment. There's never been a sermon ever taught that I've known of where a person said, man, isn't it sad how little Jesus' faith was in the garden? Isn't it unbelievable that Jesus was so shook in this moment? Maybe Jesus, if he had more faith, he wouldn't be in such anguish. No, none of us have said that, and I think it's something we need to reclaim here, and that is that if you're a follower of Jesus, sometimes life is still hard. Can I get an amen? Right? I think Jesus makes your life better at times, but Jesus ultimately makes you better at life. He makes you better at navigating all the zigs and zags that life will throw your way. And I don't know what you've heard in churches before, but maybe you've heard what I've heard. And it's this version of if you follow Jesus, you should become this rainbow puking unicorn that frolics throughout all of your chapters of your life, never experiencing pain. But that is not reality. And that is not the reality that Jesus is showing us here. Jesus is saying, you can experience distress and insecurity and frustration and confusion and even crisis of faith and yet still be a faith-filled follower of Jesus. I mean, think about it. If Jesus was God, then he knew the outcome, right? If he was really God, then he knew, this is really hard right now, but the resurrection is coming and everything's going to work out. It's all going to be all right. If he's God, he's outside of time and knows, this is going to work out. And yet Jesus in this moment, he creates a space where he allows his grief and anguish to show. I think this is so important for us because Jesus is showing us in Gethsemane that we can live in the grief of Good Friday and the hope of Resurrection Sunday at the same time. We can live in the grief of Good Friday and we can live in the hope of the Resurrection Sunday at the same time. So yes, even though it will work out, it's okay to say my tears are plentiful. And yes, I know that God works all things around for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purposes. But right now I'm angry and I'm frustrated and I'm struggling. Yes, I know that God is going to turn things around and redeem this and make a masterpiece out of the mess. But the reality is, Travis, my marriage is a mess. My mental health is a mess. My community is a mess. My faith is a mess. Friends, you need to understand it is entirely possible, and Jesus gives us permission to understand this and embrace this, that you can live in the grief of Good Friday while also simultaneously living in the hope of Resurrection Sunday. The reality of the resurrection does not negate the reality of my suffering. The reality of the resurrection does not negate or diminish the reality of my suffering. In Gethsemane, Jesus is showing us how to be human. I love that 3 times he says to God, I don't want to do this. I really don't want this cup of suffering. I really don't want to continue what's going on right now. Jesus is telling us our honest confession does not insult God. I mean, have you ever read the book of Job? Yeah, if you want to be depressed, go get a pint of ice cream and read the book of Job tonight. It's a really downer of a book, but Job loses everything. If you don't know the story, his family, his wealth, his health, he loses it all. And for 38 chapters, Job is trying to reconcile what's going on in his life. And for 38 chapters, God is completely silent. For a while, I hated the book of Job, but then I realized there are those moments where you're going through 38 chapters of hell and God is completely silent. Have you been there? Maybe you're there now, where you're wondering, God, where are you in the midst of this? And I believe we have the book of Job, one for many reasons, but one reason is because the book of Job reminds us you're not the first one to feel like God is silent, and you're not the last one to feel like God is silent. But if you read this story of Job, it's interesting because Job has some stupid friends. And I mean that. They say some of the stupidest things when you read the book of Job. Just read it. It's really interesting to watch what happens because in the midst of God's silence, Job's friends, they say really good things about God and really terrible things about Job. And what's interesting, though, is that Job, throughout these 38 chapters of silence, says really terrible things about God. Like really bad things that I didn't know you could say out loud about God without getting a lightning bolt to your face. And Job said it all. And what's so interesting about the story of Job is that after 38 chapters, around Job 42, God interjects into this story, and he says, it's my turn to talk. Y'all been doing all the talking, my turn. And God speaks, and he says something that you would never see coming after you hear what Job says. God says, Job, you have honored me with your lips. You're like, what? How did Job honor you with his lips? He was saying horrible things about you, God. He was saying how you've abandoned him, how you've forgotten him, how he wishes that you would just kill him. Like, he was saying terrible things. But then God, he says to Job's friends, he says, you've dishonored me with your lips. How? They were saying all good things about God and terrible things about Job. It's this really confusing ending. And it took me a while to figure it out, but I think I've come to a conclusion about what's going on here. Throughout the entire story, Job's friends not once talked to God. They spent all their time talking about God. Not one single time did Job's friends actually pray to God. They just talked about God and shared their opinions about God. But for 35 chapters, even if it wasn't Job's most optimistic or faith-filled or hopeful prayers, Job at least talked to God. So what the story of Job tells me is that God is okay with whatever you need to say. Just say it to him. God is okay if you're angry with him. God is okay if you're upset with him. God is okay if you're confused by him. God is okay if you're jaded about your faith. He's like, you can say what you need to say, but say it to me. And the reason this matters, because I'll just take a guess that for some of us, going through times of Gethsemane, times of pain and suffering, distress and anguish, we will spend a lot of our time talking about this to our friends, talking about this to our roommates, talking about this to our family members or close friends or community. Or if we don't have that community, what we see and what happens all the time, right? We don't have a real release valve, so we go to social media and instead we just use our Instagram story timeline as a way just to let out all of our rage. And I'm not necessarily saying any of those spaces are inherently bad, but here's an idea. What if you went to God? Like, what if you actually started going to God with what you're angry about, what you're frustrated about, what you're jaded about, what you feel abandoned in? Like, what if you started going to God first with everything that's on your mind, even if it isn't your best moment? According to the story of Job, dishonorable lips are just those who talk about God, but honorable lips are the ones that talk to God, even if all you have to say is anger and frustration. See, prayer is not where we go to escape reality with God. Prayer is where we go to face a reality with God. I think it is a common misconception when it comes to prayer and worship that, like, when we sing these songs on Sunday, we're just sort of spiritually putting our head in the ground and pretending reality doesn't exist. That's not what we're doing. At least that's not what prayer and worship was to the scriptural authors. Prayer and worship, it was us facing reality with a God who's with us in it all. Jesus was showing us what Job learned, and that is that you can show up to God and be human. In Gethsemane, we're seeing a God who bleeds. We're seeing Jesus showing us what it means to be human, but also third thing is this, that Jesus shows us relational wisdom. He's showing us relational wisdom. Did you notice? You probably did, right? Jesus didn't go to the garden alone, right? He didn't go to the garden alone. He actually invited 3 of his closest disciples to join him in what is arguably one of Jesus' most vulnerable moments next to him hanging on the cross. And he invited his 3 closest disciples. I don't know about you. I don't know if I would do that. Right? Like, if I'm the Messiah, if I'm the Savior, and I'm trying to fill my disciples with confidence, I'm not so sure I invite them to my prayer night where I'm sweating blood in the garden, begging God to take this cup of suffering away. And yet it's interesting that Jesus doesn't seem to run from vulnerability. That Jesus doesn't seem to run from being seen by others. In fact, he invites it. But you should know that Jesus doesn't invite all of his disciples, does he? He doesn't invite all 12 of his disciples. He invited only the 3 closest disciples to join him in Gethsemane. How dare Jesus? That's so exclusive, Jesus. Isn't that very cliquey of you, Jesus? I mean, what about Luke? What about Matthew? How could you just forget them and leave them there? But you invited Peter, James, and John. And you need to understand that Jesus, he's simply just showing us relational wisdom. What is Jesus showing us? He's showing us that I'm allowed to not welcome everyone into every season. I'm allowed to not welcome everyone into every season. Can you imagine how the other disciples felt, though? Luke's like, oh, we're going somewhere? And Jesus is like, yeah, we are, but you're not. So you just stay behind, Luke. And Luke probably was disappointed, but what was Jesus doing? Jesus Jesus knew who needed to be there in that space, in that moment of vulnerability with him. It was Peter, James, and John. Jesus is showing us something about relational boundaries. Show me a person who has no relational boundaries, I'll show you a very, very unhealthy person. See, not every person has the right or has the ability to see you bleed. Not every person is ready to meet you in your garden. Not every person is able to hold space for you in that moment. And it's not a knock against that person. It's not saying that they're a terrible human being. It's not an indictment on their character. It is simply just the truth of the matter. That there are some people who can hold space for you when you're bleeding, and there's others who cannot. You know what's worse than being in the garden alone? It's being in the garden with the wrong people. It's being in the garden with people who cannot hold space or who cannot watch you bleed in a moment of vulnerability. But I also want you to notice something else about this moment that is also relational advice. Not only did he seem to have some relational boundaries there, but Jesus actually told his disciples, like he brings them into the garden and he says, I am in distress, I am in anguish, I need you to be near me and I need you to be praying. He actually just went there and told them, here's why you're here, here's what's going on. He didn't like walk around and try and give them like passive cues. He didn't walk around like Eeyore, like, how you doing, Jesus? Oh, I'm fine, just, a little sleepy today. No, he didn't force them to try and deduce what was really going on. He just said, here's what's going on. I'm in distress, I'm in anguish, I need you to pray with me. I need you to be near me. I think Jesus is showing us something about relational wisdom, and that is that if we are going to practice relational wisdom in the midst of our garden moments, we need to get the right people around us, and we need to tell them why they're there. We need to tell them what is going on. We need to be willing to be vulnerable and share what is really happening. Talk about the crisis of faith. Talk about the distress. Talk about the anguish. Talk about the depression. And we need to talk about this because I've seen some people, I've experienced it firsthand, people who will leave a friend group or they'll even leave a church, and they'll leave because they say that church didn't show up for them. That my friends didn't show up for them. Even though those friends of the church cared for them, they'll be like, they didn't show up for me. And they'll be like, wasn't it obvious I was going through something? I was clearly so angry and sad. I didn't say anything during lunch. And then after service on Sunday, I just left immediately, not talking to anyone. So how did they not know that I was going through a tough time? I guess they just don't care about me. Can we just have a grown-up talk about this and how this is a faulty version of thinking? Because at the end of the day, if you come to me and say, I'm leaving this friend group and I'm leaving this church because they didn't show up for me, here's what I'm going to ask you. Did you tell them that you were depressed? Did you tell them you were having a crisis of faith? Did you tell them that you were in a difficult place, that you were struggling, that you were suffering? Did you actually tell them what was going on? We cannot blame others for not responding to information you never gave them. Man, I just need to say it out loud again because it needs to go from our head to our heart. We cannot blame others for not responding to information that you never gave them. Jesus, he's like, I am in distress. I'm anguished. I'm crushed. I need you to be near me. But here's the thing that you probably noticed in the story. What did Peter, James, and John, the three that Jesus invited, the three that he opened his heart up to and was like, I'm in distress. This is a tough moment for me. What did those three disciples do? They fell asleep, the jerks, right? Like Jesus opens up his heart, and they didn't even fall asleep once or twice. They fell asleep 3 times. Can I tell you something? Even those who love you so much and truly are your friends, sometimes they're going to still fall asleep on you when you needed them most. And I'm not saying that you just get over it and act like it doesn't hurt. I think it frustrated Jesus. But it leads me to the fourth and final thing we learn in Gethsemane, is that in Gethsemane, God does something, and that is that God redirects our misplaced expectations. When we are in Gethsemane, God redirects our misplaced expectations. I want to read Luke's account of Jesus in Gethsemane because we see the same story, but there's this one detail that Luke sort of sneaks in there that I think is the perfect place for us to end on this morning. Here's what Luke writes. He says, then, accompanied by the disciples, Jesus left the upstairs room and went as usual to the Mount of Olives There he told them, pray that you will not give in to temptation. This all should sound familiar. It's the same, right? Then verse 41, he walked away about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, Father, if you're willing, please take this cup of suffering away from me, yet I want your will to be done, not mine. All the same. This is familiar. Then verse 43, then an angel from heaven appeared and strengthened him. He prayed more fervently, and he was in such agony of the spirit that his sweat fell to the ground like drops of blood. At last he stood up again and returned to the disciples only to find them asleep, exhausted from grief. Why are you sleeping? He asked. Get up and pray so that you will not give in to temptation. See, I need to just zoom in on two things. The last part, they were exhausted. Why? Because of grief. Can we maybe offer some grace to our friends who love us, but maybe fall asleep on us? And maybe they fall asleep because maybe they've hit their capacity too. Like we all have a capacity. We all have a limit. And instead of just indicting the character of that person and saying, well, I guess they just don't care, I'm going to go find new friends. Instead, we go, I wonder what's going on in their life. I wonder what grief they're carrying as well. But Gethsemane teaches us something that's so important, and that is that God uses these moments of suffering, of pain, of distress and anguish to redirect our misplaced expectations. You see, human help will only go so far. Human help will only go so far. And some of us, we've actually been going to our friends looking for heavenly help, and all they're ever able to do is offer you human help. You're hungry, they can cook you a meal. You're injured, they can take you to the ER. You're lonely, they can be a presence in your life. But there comes a point in time in all of our lives in the middle of Gethsemane where we need more than human help. We need heavenly help. We need heavenly help, and we see that in verse 43. What happened when the disciples fell asleep on Jesus? God sends an angel to provide the energy and strength that Jesus needed the most in that moment. See, some of us have allowed ourselves to be perpetually let down by other people because you've put heavenly expectations on humanly vessels. You've put heavenly expectations on human vessels. The help that our souls need in the middle of Gethsemane is a heavenly help. Human help can help your body, but heavenly help helps your soul. It gives you the strength and energy you need in your soul. See, I think there's a reason that Jesus didn't skip Gethsemane, and it's the same reason we can't either. It's because it's in those moments where all we're experiencing is hell. It's in those moments, in this mysterious way, that God gives us a heavenly hope. It's in those moments that God shows up in a way that no human could ever show up. And it's in those moments when you're at the end of yourself, you're at the end of your strength, and you have more questions than answers. You may have no answers, but you're face down in the middle of whatever your Gethsemane is. It's in those moments you discover a depth of God's power that you would have never experienced had you not gone through your Gethsemane. You know, sometimes I think God loves us too much to let us skip pain. Because God knows that it's in that context of pain, in that context of Gethsemane, that we learn to trust him in a way we never have before. I've met a lot of people who want to experience miracles in their life. The funny thing is that very few people ever want to be in a situation that necessitates a miracle. If you want miracles, you're going to go through Gethsemane. Before Jesus got to the resurrection, he experienced the darkest of nights, face down in the garden. But it was there that he experienced a heavenly